Hello, everyone. My name is Julio Montanez. I am a graduate student in the Department of Sociology at the University of Central Florida. My UCF faculty mentors are Dr. Amy Donley and Dr. Amy Rechtenwald. This presentation will include a discussion of multidimensional approaches to interpersonal violence. When people discuss violence, how do they talk about it? One way people discuss violence may be to name broad types of violence based on making statements like, I was a victim of domestic violence, or I was abused as a child. Alternatively, someone may say something along the lines of, he beat me up, or she threatened me with a knife. Victims may also make other statements to give voice to their experiences, like, it lasted for months, then years, or it hurt badly, or it happened a lot. In this way, victims implicitly name violence dimensions, which exist to varying degrees in each violent act, situation, or pattern. As such, we can view violence through a multidimensional lens. These dimensions of violence answer basic questions regarding violent acts, situations, and patterns. For example, violent behaviors, acts, or events answer the question of what. Hitting, slapping, and yelling are specific actions that can fall into this dimension. Violence types answer the question of which. Examples of types would include physical or sexual violence. Severity would answer how much, focusing on levels such as moderate or severe violence. Next, violence frequency answers the question of how often, such as frequently, sometimes, often, or never. A related and overlapping construct, duration, can be figured by asking how long, yielding descriptors like months or years. Finally, perpetrator quantity answers the question of how many. While all dimensions, in some way, occur at once, certain configurations of violence make certain dimensions more pronounced in a situation or pattern of violence. For those who are familiar with Professor Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, the depiction of a traffic intersection can be applied. Just as cars venture from different directions into the intersection, violence dimensions venture from different directions and interact to shape victims' experiences. Examples and terminologies in the multidimensional violence literature are diverse. For example, polyvictimization can be used to describe some types of violence. Strangulation can be seen as a hybrid violent act, in which control supercharges physical violence. Moreover, unlike a slap, the perpetrator can extend the duration of the act. Workplace mobbing involves psychological violence by many people over a period of time. The recurring escalation of the cycle of violence exists where type, duration, severity, and frequency intersect. In-person and cyberbullying intersect to form dual bullying. Cascading maltreatment, a form of re-victimization and found in the elderly abuse literature, involves one perpetrator's violence triggering violence from another perpetrator. How do we measure violence from a multidimensional perspective? Well, there are a number of ways. The first way focuses on relationships. For example, using bivariate analysis like cross-tabulation to see if there is an association between experiencing psychological violence and physical violence. The second way involves variety scores. In this method, the respondent is asked how frequently they experience a variety of violent acts, like slapping and punching. In data analysis, the frequencies of the acts are summed together. Combinations are another method, in which, for example, experiencing sexual violence in relation to depressive symptoms is compared to experiencing sexual and physical violence in relation to depressive symptoms. The next method, schemes, focuses on placing different weights on different violence types. For example, Based on the impact of violence types from previous research, a researcher may assign a higher score to one type of violence and a lower score to another type, then analyze the data accordingly. A more sophisticated means of analyzing multiple dimensions at once involves person-centered approaches. For example, in latent class analysis, multiple variables measuring various dimensions like type and severity can be input. The results of the analysis may show groups of victimization experiences, as well as the probability that each group will experience a certain type and severity of violence. Finally, you can simply count the number of types experienced. For example, experiencing only physical violence would equal experiencing one type. Experiencing psychological and physical violence would equate to two types. Likewise, experiencing psychological and sexual violence would equate to two types. Analyses can then be completed that weigh the impact of one versus two types on a health outcome. With these methodological intricacies in mind, there are a number of aspects of the multidimensional approach that need addressing. For example, stemming from the field of epidemiology's work on infectious diseases, some violence, like firearm violence, can move from setting to setting, essentially shape-shifting across time and space. This brings up the question of whether space is a dimension of violence itself. More research is needed. Finally, there are varying definitions to name similar phenomena. For example, while the term polyvictimization was born out of the interpersonal violence literature, researchers can differentiate between interpersonal violence versus structural and institutional sources of victimization. Thus, while we are discussing the intricacies of interpersonal violence, we may ask in conclusion if interpersonal violence is a dimension of violence itself. I thank you for listening and appreciate your time. Best wishes to everybody on their scholarly journeys.